In the small town of Chesterville, nestled among the snowy plains of the Midwest, Christmas was always a time of quiet celebration. The streets were still dark, but the first rays of winter sun were already painting the horizon in soft hues of pink and orange. Snowflakes, slowly twirling, covered the roofs of houses and lampposts, creating an illusion of a fairy tale. The bells of the local church rang softly, reminding the townspeople of the festive morning service. Madeline Carter, a woman in her 30s, approached the church, clutching a worn leather wallet in her hands. She wore an old mustard-colored coat, visibly worn but neatly patched. Her chestnut hair peeked out from under a knitted hat, her cheeks flushed from the cold wind. Despite the simplicity of her appearance, there was a special inner warmth about her. She stopped at the church entrance, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The church was cozy and old, with wooden pews and stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes. The soft light of candles reflected on the stone walls, creating an atmosphere of peace and comfort. The air was filled with a faint scent of pine and hot wax. Madeline knelt in a quiet corner, closed her eyes, and began to pray silently. She asked for peace, kindness, and strength to continue coping with daily difficulties. When the prayer ended, Madeline stood up, adjusted her coat, and headed for the exit. Her face was lit up with a slight smile, and her eyes sparkled with anticipation of the day. She had been saving money for a long time to treat herself to lunch at a small Italian restaurant in the town center. For most people, this might seem unremarkable, but for Madeline, who lived on modest earnings from occasional freelance jobs, it was a real luxury. However, her steps slowed when she noticed a figure sitting on a distant bench by the window. An elderly man, thin and hunched, sat alone, his head lowered. His shoulders were slightly trembling, and his thin hands clutched a worn hat. Madeleine hesitated, but then took a step forward. When she approached, she saw the man slowly raising his head. His face was tired, with deep wrinkles speaking of years of hardship. His eyes, light gray and weary, met hers. They held an endless sadness. "Excuse me, are you okay?" she asked softly, trying not to startle him. The man blinked as if only now noticing her. He quickly looked away and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm fine, miss," he replied weakly, but his voice trembled. "Just memories." Madeline sat down on the bench next to him, leaving enough space for him to feel comfortable. "Sometimes it gets easier if you share," she said quietly. "I'm here to listen if you want to." The man was silent for a long time, clutching his hat in his hands. Finally, he sighed and spoke. "I wanted to spend Christmas with my family. I have a son. He recently got married. They have a little boy, my grandson. I came to see them, hoping to be part of their celebration, even if just for a little while. But they said they had other plans. They just turned me away." He stopped, his voice breaking. Madeleine felt her heart tighten. "That must be very painful," she said softly. The man nodded, his gaze distant. "They didn't want to see me," he continued. "Now I'm spending Christmas alone. I don't even know why I came here. Maybe to feel less lonely." Madeleine bit her lip, wondering how best to support him. An idea flashed through her mind. She looked at her wallet. Everything she had saved for her own lunch could bring this person some warmth and joy. "Wait here," she suddenly said, standing up. "I'll be right back." The man looked at her with doubt but nodded. His shoulders slumped slightly again, as if he didn't expect her to actually return. Madeline, without wasting time, headed to the nearest store, full of determination. She didn't know exactly how her day would change, but at that moment, she realized helping this person was the most important thing she could do this Christmas. Madeline hurried through the streets, sliding on the icy sidewalks, trying not to waste a minute. Her thoughts revolved around how best to support the elderly man. She found a small shop that was already open early in the morning. In the window, festive decorations sparkled, and from inside came the soft sound of Christmas music. Madeline stopped at the entrance and quickly scanned the shelves. The first thing that caught her eye was a cup of hot coffee sitting on the counter. Next to it lay fresh cookies, packed in a clear bag with a red ribbon. These simple things could warm and comfort the man who clearly needed kindness. She also noticed a small Christmas card with an image of a snowy forest and bright red cardinals. The scene on the card seemed particularly warm and soothing to her. She quickly chose these items and went to the checkout. The cashier, a young man with a tired face, smiled at her. "Last-minute gifts?" he asked, scanning the items. "Something like that," Madeline replied with a slight smile. "Just trying to make someone's day a little better." The young man nodded, seemingly impressed by her words. Madeline took out a small amount from her wallet, saved for lunch, and paid. She left herself only a little change, but this did not bother her. With the package in her hands, she hurried back to the church. When she returned, the elderly man was still sitting on the same bench. His gaze was fixed on the floor, and he looked even more dejected than before. Madeline stopped for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Here, this is for you," she said softly, handing him the coffee and bag of cookies. The man looked up, his face reflecting surprise. He slowly took the cup as if not believing it was really for him. "You came back," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Madeline replied confidently. "Christmas is a time for sharing kindness." She placed the card next to him on the bench. The man looked at it, then carefully opened it. Inside was a simple but warm message. "You are not alone. May this Christmas bring you some joy." His eyes filled with tears. He took a deep breath, trying to hold back his emotions, but his voice trembled as he spoke. "It's been so long since someone showed me kindness. Thank you, miss. You have no idea what this means to me." Madeline smiled, sitting down next to him. Sometimes a little kindness is all it takes to make the day better. "Do you have any plans for today?" The man shook his head. I thought I'd just stay here. It's, quiet and a little warmer than outside." Madeline thought for a moment. Her own plans for the day suddenly seemed less important. She looked at him and said, "Why don't you join me? I was planning to have lunch at a restaurant. I could use the company." The man froze, clearly shocked by her offer. I don't know," he muttered. "It's too much." "No too much," Madeline interrupted. "Christmas is better when shared, and you wouldn't be imposing. Please." The man looked at her for a long time before nodding. His face brightened slightly, and a faint glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. Madeline smiled, feeling a warmth spread within her. At that moment, she knew she had made the right decision. The restaurant in the center of Chesterville was small but cozy. The window was decorated with twinkling garlands, and the air inside was filled with the aroma of freshly prepared dishes. The warm light of the lamps gave the place a feeling of comfort. As Madeline and Grayson, as she learned the elderly man was called, entered, they felt the cold outside instantly fade away. "I haven't been to places like this in years," Grayson admitted quietly, looking around the restaurant. His eyes sparkled with memories. Madeline chose a table by the window. A waiter, a young man with a friendly smile, quickly brought the menus. Madeline carefully studied the dishes, mentally calculating what she could afford, and noticing her hesitation, Grayson gently said, "Allow me to treat you." "It's the least I can do." Madeline wanted to refuse, but seeing the sincerity in his eyes, she nodded, gratefully smiling. Their order was simple: hot tomato soup for both, and a small portion of pasta for Madeline. As they waited, Grayson slowly began to talk about his life. He told her how he was an engineer at an automobile factory, how he tried his best for his family, but over time, their relationship deteriorated. His son blamed him for being too strict, and after his wife's death, the connection with the family almost broke. Madeline listened attentively, empathizing with every word. When he finished, she shared her own story, how she lost her job at a large company for standing up for employees' rights. The company not only fired her, but also withheld her pay. Now she does freelance jobs to make ends meet. Grayson looked at her with respect and warmth. "You are an incredibly strong woman," he said quietly. "Not many could endure what you've been through." Madeline smiled, though a lump of emotions welled up inside her. They talked until their food got cold, sharing stories and feelings. Grayson felt that their meeting was not by chance, and Madeline, for the first time in a long time, felt that someone truly understood her pain. Their lunch ended, but the feeling of warmth remained. Grayson walked Madeline to her home, promising that he would find a way to thank her for her kindness. Madeline just smiled, not suspecting that this day would mark the beginning of big changes in her life. "Madeleine," tired but content, returned to her apartment. Her home was small but cozy, a place she had created with love despite her financial struggles. In the corner stood a tiny vase with an artificial Christmas tree, decorated with homemade ornaments and a single string of blinking lights. This was her attempt to keep the spirit of Christmas alive despite all the problems. She brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into an old armchair by the window. Snowflakes gently swirled outside, creating a cozy and peaceful atmosphere in the room. Her thoughts returned to her encounter with Grayson. He seemed like a man who had lost everything: family, warmth, confidence in people. And yet at the moment he thanked her, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. This warmth filled her soul as well. How can such simple things have such a profound impact on a person? She wondered aloud, looking at the steaming cup of tea. Her reverie was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Madeline startled. Who could be visiting so late? It was almost 9 in the evening. She cautiously stood up, feeling her heartbeat quicken. Just in case, she peeked through the peephole. Standing outside was Grayson, but he now looked completely different. His back was straight, shoulders squared, and there was a determined gleam in his eyes. Behind him stood 3 men in formal suits. The men held themselves calmly, exuding an air of seriousness and authority. Madeline slowly opened the door, puzzled. Grayson? What's going on? He smiled gently, extending a hand holding an envelope tied with a red ribbon. Madeline, he began, his voice gentle yet firm, you did something for me that I will never forget. Today I want to thank you. She felt embarrassed, unsure of how to react. Grayson nodded toward the men behind him. This is my team. They will help you resolve your issues. Let me explain. Madeline silently invited them in. The guests carefully settled in her small living room. Grayson sat across from her, still holding the envelope he hadn't let go of. After our conversation, I realized that your struggles are unjust, he continued. No one should have to fight alone. I know what it's like to feel powerless against the system, and I decided I had to do something. One of the men in formal attire, introducing himself as Mr. Harris, handed Madeline a small tablet with documents. She glanced at them briefly and saw the name of her former company. Her hands trembled. We've looked into your case, Ms. Carter, Mr. Harris explained, and we've concluded that you have a strong basis to sue your former employer. We will cover all legal expenses and provide you with full support. Madeline looked up at Grayson, unable to believe what was happening. But why? Why are you doing this for me? Grayson smiled, his eyes shining with sincerity. Because you were the first person in many years to show me kindness without expecting anything in return. You changed my Christmas, and now it's my turn to change yours. He handed her the envelope. Madeline carefully opened it and found inside a check for a significant amount of money. This money will help you while we sort out your case, Mr. Harris added. Your former employer will be held accountable. Tears filled Madeline's eyes. She clutched the envelope tightly, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Grayson shook his head. Just keep being yourself. Sometimes that's enough to change someone's life. They discussed the plans, details of the case, and necessary steps for a long time. When the guests left, Madeline was alone in her apartment. Her heart felt light, as if all her burdens were beginning to lift. She looked at the small Christmas tree in the corner and felt that this Christmas would be the beginning of something new. The next day, Madeline woke up with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. After yesterday's meeting with Grayson and his team, her heart was filled with gratitude and confidence that change was possible. She carefully gathered all the documents related to her former job, letters, contracts, pay stubs, and packed them into an old leather folder. She headed to the office that Grayson's lawyers had indicated. It was a modern glass skyscraper in the city center, its facade gleaming in the sun. Madeline felt a slight uncertainty, but reminded herself that she was no longer alone. Clutching the folder tightly, she stepped inside. In the reception area, she was greeted by a smiling secretary who led her to a spacious conference room. Behind a large table sat the lawyers, Mr. Harris, whom she had met the day before, and his colleagues. Grayson was there too, his friendly smile instantly making Madeline feel more confident. Good morning, Ms. Carter, Mr. Harris greeted her. "We are ready to get to work. Before we discuss the details, I want you to know, we believe in your case." Madeline nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you. This means a lot to me." The lawyers listened attentively to her story, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. As she shared the details of her dismissal and the unfair treatment she endured, her voice was filled with bitterness and pain accumulated over months. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, which Mr. Harris broke. "This case is stronger than I expected. Your former employer not only violated labor laws, but also deliberately withheld your payments. We are confident that we have a strong basis for a successful lawsuit." Madeline felt the tension ease slightly. She looked at Grayson, who nodded in agreement with the lawyer's words. "We will file the lawsuit within a week," Mr. Harris continued. "During this time, you don't need to worry about the details. We will handle everything. However, there is a possibility that the company will try to settle out of court." "What does that mean?" Madeline asked. "It means they might offer compensation to avoid a public trial," Mr. Harris explained. "The decision to accept it will be yours." She nodded, trying to process everything that was said. Her thoughts were still a mix of fear and hope. Grayson, noticing her doubts, spoke gently. "Madeline, you are not alone in this. We will be with you every step of the way. This process might not be easy, but you deserve justice." His words soothed her. She exhaled and managed a smile. "Thank you. I'm ready to fight." With that, the meeting concluded. The lawyers promised to keep her updated on all developments, and Grayson offered to drive her home. On the way, they talked about life. Grayson shared how, after his wife's death, he threw himself into work to distract from the pain. But this only deepened the rift with his family. His openness touched Madeline. She felt their encounter was not by chance. Back home, as she laid out the papers and recalled the details of the meeting, Madeline felt a strange sense of relief. She knew a long and difficult road lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she believed that everything would be okay. A few days later, Mr. Harris's team filed the lawsuit. Soon, the first steps in the proceedings began, exchanging documents, requests to the company. Each detail filled Madeline with excitement, but she held on thanks to the support of the lawyers and Grayson. They often called her, explaining the process and updating her on the case's progress. At one point, the company did offer compensation, but the amount was laughably small. The lawyers immediately rejected the offer, saying they would fight for more. Madeline felt confidence in their words. She no longer felt like a victim. She was ready to stand up for her rights. At one stage of the proceedings, Mr. Harris informed her that the company had started using aggressive tactics. They tried to accuse Madeline of incompetence, presenting false documents, but the legal team was prepared. They provided evidence to the contrary, undermining the opponent's credibility. Throughout this time, Grayson was by her side. He not only morally supported Madeline, but also helped her with everyday tasks, such as grocery delivery or organizing finances. He became a true friend to her, and she realized that his help extended far beyond legal support. When the first official hearing began, Madeline sat in the courtroom, holding a sheet of notes. Mr. Harris confidently presented her case with clear facts and emotional persuasion. Madeline watched as he dismantled the opponent's arguments, feeling that the truth was finally coming to light. After the hearing, Mr. Harris approached her and said, "We are on the right track. You will succeed." Madeline felt tears well up in her eyes. This was not just a fight for money or justice. It was a fight for her dignity, for her belief that she could stand up to even the toughest challenges, and now she knew she would not give up. Several months had passed since the process began, and on this day, Madeline felt as if she were standing on the threshold of a new life. The final court hearing took place in a small but formal courtroom in Chesterville. Madeline, dressed in her best dress, sat at the plaintiff's table with Mr. Harris. Grayson sat in the front row, supporting her with his presence. The company's lawyers tried once again to portray her as weak and incompetent, but Mr. Harris's team was ready. Throughout the proceedings, they methodically exposed the false statements, presenting compelling evidence. Each word from Mr. Harris sounded like a confident step toward victory. "Ms. Carter," the judge addressed her, looking intently, "your claims against the company are impressive in their consistency and substantiation. This case is not just about justice, but also about the honesty of employers toward their employees. When the judge announced the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The company was found guilty of violating labor laws. The court ordered them to pay Madeline compensation for all withheld payments, including moral damages, and to issue her a formal apology. Madeline could not hold back her tears. She looked up at Grayson, who smiled broadly and nodded as if saying, "I knew you could do it." After the trial, everyone gathered in a small cafe nearby. Grayson insisted on celebrating her victory. Sitting at a table decorated with bright napkins and a small vase of flowers, Madeline could not believe what was happening. "Madeline, you deserve this," Grayson said, raising a cup of coffee. "Your strength and determination have inspired not only me, but everyone around you." "Thank you, Grayson," she replied, smiling sincerely. "But I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." He just smiled, shaking his head slightly. "Sometimes all it takes is a little push, and you did the rest yourself." The day wore on, and they stepped out of the cafe to take a stroll through the quiet streets. The snow fell softly, covering everything in a white blanket. It reminded her of that very day when they first met. Grayson, looking at her, said quietly, "You know, this process has changed not just your life. You helped me remember what it means to believe in people. And that kindness is not weakness, but strength." Madeline looked at him warmly. "And you helped me understand that sometimes help comes when you least expect it." They stopped in front of her house. Grayson handed her a small box tied with a red ribbon. Inside was a small figurine of an angel with a simple yet touching message: faith and kindness. Madeline felt tears well up in her eyes again. "Thank you, Grayson," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "You are not just a friend. You have become part of my family." He smiled, holding back his own emotions. "And you mine." They stood under the falling snow, understanding that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Madeline knew that challenges lay ahead, but now she had not only confidence but also the support to move forward. This story began with a simple act of kindness, but it turned into a journey that changed two lives. Madeleine felt that her small world had become brighter, and Christmas would always remind her of the power of kindness and faith. "Grayson, do you know what this miracle is?" she suddenly asked, smiling through her tears. "What is it?" he asked gently. "That one chance encounter can change everything." He nodded, and together they walked toward her home, leaving behind not just footprints in the fresh snow, but a new story filled with warmth and light.